Horror. Definitely horror. Horror, horror, all the time horror. And oogity boogities, and these friendly faces, and this handsome chap, and these adorable little children, and these squishy little goblins. I want to read about horror. I want to read about people in the horror industry. But most importantly, I want to watch horror movies. What is going on, moms and dads of Lorcana? It's Chris here from A Parent's Guide to Lorcana, and we're so happy to have you back on the channel. Today is the first episode of a brand new segment called What Do You Do When You're Not Playing Lorcana? For me, lots of things. Now, we're not going to go over everything that I do when I'm not playing Lorcana in this one video, but I am going to put out a series of videos, each one talking about one of my other interests, because there are other interests other than Lorcana. I'm hoping it'll give you guys an opportunity to get to know me a bit better, and maybe you're into a lot of the same things that I'm into, and that's super exciting. So for today's episode, we're going to talk about monsters. Monsters have been a huge part of my life. I've watched monster movies since as long as I can remember. I've got monster movie tattoos. I've got monster movie t-shirts. I've got monster movie toys. I love monster movies. And very few things have the same spot in my heart as monster movies. And I wanted to go over some of the movies that got me slowly dipping my toes into the genre. I'm not going to go over every single movie I've ever seen because that would take us forever. But I am going to touch base on a couple of the ones that I saw in the order that I saw them, roughly. For the most part, the segment is family friendly, but I will get to a part in this episode where we talk about some films that are definitely not for the little ones. I'll let you know. So we can pause the video, have them go play some Nintendo Switch, and then we can come back and talk about some more not family-friendly horror movies. So for me, it all started with the classics, the classic monsters, Wolfman, Creature from the Black Lagoon, and the entire gang. All the classic Universal movie monsters. These movies have such a special place in my heart. Not only is it because they're fantastic films, cinematography is great, the acting is top shelf, but when I wanted to start watching horror movies, my dad said, "You're a little too young." I was probably 7 around the time. But he said, "Here are some films that are definitely a little creepy, but they're age appropriate." Because of my dad introducing me to these classic horror monsters, I was able to take my first step into a larger world, if you will, and experience the true horror cinema. Right around the same time as I got introduced to those films, I started watching this Canadian classic, The Hilarious House of Frightenstein. This is a wonderful, kid-friendly, monster-driven TV show. It was on for, I want to say, 3 or 4 seasons, maybe not even that much. Hilarious House of Frightenstein is kind of like a skit show, and it was comedy, and it all centered around Count Frightenstein in his hilarious House of Frightenstein's castle. You got all the classic Universal characters, kind of. They're versions of them because we don't want to copyright them. You have your Wolfman Jack, you have your Count, you have Bruce the Frankenstein monster. This was a game changer for me. Being able to watch it live or in syndication on my TV and give me exposure to monsters whenever I wanted to. I had never experienced anything like this, not without renting a VHS video and bringing it home and watching it deliberately. The fact that there was this kind of programming on TV here in Canada when I was a kid, this is what made Monster Kids Monster Kids. And obviously, now that we have a taste for it, I am out there actively looking for more monsters, goblins, ghoulies of any kind. And again, being a child of the 80s and 90s, I was very lucky. We got My Pet Monster, our buddy Monzy here, and the Beetlejuice cartoon show. Easy access to scary goblins, ghoulies, ghosts, monsters, demons, the undead, to kids with appropriate child content, appropriate child stories that just gave them enough adventure that they were excited that they were watching some scary monsters, but not enough to give them nightmares and not enough to make your parents question what you were watching on Saturday morning cartoons. My dad also had a love for classic black and white movies. I was very lucky because not only were they monster movies, but the original 1952 Godzilla and the original Night of the Living Dead were both films he had in his collection, and he let me watch. I was probably around nine years old when I first saw these. Night of the Living Dead is a little adult, probably for a 7-year-old. In hindsight, I was born in 79, so times were different in the 80s, but there is a bit of violence, there's a little bit of nudity, and it can be very intense. I would not necessarily say this is where you want to start with your kids when you're watching your classic horror movies. I think the classic Universals are I won't say scary, but they're creepy enough, but they're not inappropriate. Watch at your own risk. Maybe a good PSA is watch these movies first before you decide if you want to show them to your kids or not. Same with Godzilla. Again, there's nothing inappropriate about it, but there's lots of destruction. There's lots of screaming people. There's lots of, there's lots of danger. And again, you know your child better than I do. You can determine what's too intense for them. Horror comedies were a big thing. Unfortunately, for some reason, I think I may have loaned it out. I do not have my copy of Monster Squad, but I'll put a picture up here. Monster Squad was the first movie I saw in the theater. We actually went to go see He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, and I'll never forget that we went a week early. Now, this was back when you had to look in your newspaper to see when the movies were coming out, what day, what time, what cinema, and we just got our wires crossed, and we drove over to the cinema. We thought we were going to go see Masters of the Universe. It wasn't out yet, but Monster Squad was. So my dad, being my dad, a lover of film, wanted to promote my love of scary monsters. Let me go see Monster Squad with him, and that was huge. That was a brand new world of horror comedy that I hadn't really experienced up to that point, and that was a perfect segue into Ghostbusters, the ultimate horror comedy. This movie, that opening library scene, I know there's a statute of limitations, but just in case you haven't seen it, I'm not going to spoil it for you. And if your kids are watching, I definitely don't want to spoil it for you. But that library scene at the intro, I showed my son that movie a little too early, and that gave him nightmares for almost 6 months. So again, proceed with caution, but for the most part, Ghostbusters 1 and 2 and the new Ghostbusters Afterlife movie that just came out, these are all definitely child safe. Might be a little inappropriate, some sexual innuendo and maybe the odd curse word, but for the most part, there's nothing too traumatizing for your kids. Unless they don't like that library scene, like my son didn't. Then you've been warned. The library scene can be intense, but this is a great jumping on point. Now, having access to monsters on TV was a really big thing. When it came out for TV, this first one with Tim Curry was a made-for-TV movie, and it was a two-parter. I don't know if it was Saturday and Saturday the week later or Saturday and Sunday of the same week, but I remember watching it in 2 parts. I remember my mom not being 100% sold on letting me watch it, and my dad was pretty sure that it wasn't going to be that inappropriate. Again, there is some sensitive topics on this one. There is talk of suicide, there is abuse, there's violence. So this is not necessarily kid appropriate, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a good scare without a whole lot of inappropriate visuals that you want to hide your kids' eyes from. But again, just seeing something like this on TV, this was mind-blowing for the time, just to be able to turn this on. There's also a show back in the 80s called Werewolf. I love this show, but there has been, I want to say, this gridlock of the musician who made the score and the producers of the movie are not agreeing on rights and royalties. So because they can't release the shows on DVD, because the music in them isn't owned by the production company, this is something that we don't think we're ever going to see on Blu-ray. But the fact that back in the 80s we had the Werewolf TV show, we had the It made-for-TV movie, we were getting these things that were at the time, not mainstream, because horror back then is not what horror is now. Everyone loves a good scare now, and it's so popular, and you release a movie in the theaters and it makes $1 billion, and people love horror movies. People love horror franchises. You say the word Insidious or Conjuring or Paranormal Activity or Scream or Halloween, people will go see these movies because they're solidified brands that have been in the world for a very long time. But back then, we didn't have that kind of love for horror. It was very underground. Horror conventions were small. You'd rent out like the business space in a Ramada or a Best Western or something like that, and you'd go and have a small little horror convention. It was very cult-like in the 80s and 90s. So the fact that we got this on TV when we did, and I was young enough to experience it, again, just changed the game for me as far as consuming scary things. The first scary movie I remember seeing that terrified me to my core was, now that I think about it, not so much because the movie was scary, but that my dad kept telling me, I don't want you to watch that because it's too scary for you. My buddy Davey, his dad had a massive VHS and Betamax collection, hundreds of VHS tapes. And a movie that he had in his collection was House. This movie scared the life out of me when I was a kid. Again, going back and watching it now, there's nothing really inappropriate about this movie, nothing that should have given me the heebie-jeebies, but I think it was more that my buddy Davey was like, oh, we shouldn't watch that, it's too scary. And Davey's dad told my dad, oh, that's a real scary one, the boys shouldn't watch that. And then my dad says, don't watch that movie. So, of course, what do I want to do? I want to watch the movie. And I did, and it ruined my life for a very, very long time. So much so that even as an adult, when I got this DVD in my hands, I almost didn't want to watch it. Even now, being a seasoned horror vet, I thought it was going to be too scary for me. I thought that it was going to be too intense for me because I was remembering it from a 9-year-old's eyes, or what, 8, 9, whatever it was. Upon watching, there was nothing that should have scared me this much. But as a 9-year-old, I was terrified. So take that with a grain of salt. This movie is a great, creepy gateway movie for the young ones. But you may want to wait till they're 10, 11, or 12 to show it to them, because there are some very creepy special effects, all practical effects, a lot of ghoulies and goblins and pus and blood, and it's all wonderfully done, but it might be a little too intense depending on the age. But again, good gateway movie was House back in the 80s. The 80s really started to kind of come about with some fantastic cult movies you heard about, but weren't 100% sure that even existed. For me, I'm a huge arachnophobic. Kingdom of the Spiders with William Shatner ruined my life. This was on TV on a Tuesday afternoon. I was homesick from school, and this thing came on. It's essentially a town that gets overrun by spiders. If you're arachnophobic, this is not for you. If your kids don't like bugs, this is not for them. But this is definitely one of those films that we heard about that I finally got my hands on after I saw it when I was homesick. There was a time there when I thought I was delusional. I couldn't remember the name of the movie. I kept saying the guy from Star Trek, I think, is in it. It took me forever to figure this out, what this film was in my early teens, that I was able to get myself a copy. Once you get to the end of the 80s and the early 90s, you realize when you go to the horror section of your local Blockbuster or Jumbo Video, for you guys at home who are under 30, you have no idea what that is. But before Netflix, before streaming services, you had to go to a video store, kind of like this. You would walk around, you would pick your video, you would grab some snacks, you'd go home on a Friday night with your date, and you'd watch a movie or two. That really kind of expanded my mind. Seeing the horror section in the video store, what sold it for me was all the different box art. The movie might have been trash on the inside, but the box art, the absolute joy I got from seeing crazy graphics, or a big giant monster, or a centipede eating a town, or a demon, or something like that. I had to see what was inside. I had to see what movie was behind the box, and hopefully the movie was as good as the artwork. It wasn't always, but because of that, I found the Return of the Living Dead series. This series drove home my love for zombies because it was not as serious as Night of the Living Dead, but it had some wonderful practical effects. This is a real creepy one. It's a real gross one. There's lots of blood. There's lots of gore. This changed the way I looked for zombie movies, and I always looked for zombie movies after I saw Return of the Living Dead. There was also a time when I was in love with small horror creatures. Critters, gremlins, ghoulies, boglins, little boglin toys. I had to have these little boglin toys back in the 80s. Puppet Master, little tiny puppets that came to life and tortured people and terrorized people. I loved tiny monsters. Ghoulies and Ghoulies 2 were huge for me. These were like the holy grail of tiny monsters, because Critters and Gremlins were easily accessible. Gremlins was actually a mainstream film that made lots and lots of money, made lots of success, and essentially put Mogwais and Gizmo on the map. But these guys, the Ghoulies, they weren't cute. They weren't cuddly. They were summoned from the pits of hell, ready to terrorize. And I could not love little monsters anymore, and the Ghoulies locked it in for me. Now, sometimes you'll come across a movie where the movie itself isn't a horror movie, but then you go back in the director's catalog of films that they've done, and you realize that maybe there are some scarier movies there that you didn't know of before. One of my favorite movies of all time is Big Trouble in Little China. This has got some horror themes in it, but it isn't a horror movie at all. I would never even say it's a scary movie. But the fact that John Carpenter did this, well, he did The Thing, and he did one of my favorite movies of all time, The Prince of Darkness. Now, this is a horror movie. It's religious horror, it's creepy, it's gross, it's really scary. This is kind of where I would say is the top end for maybe this is not appropriate for kids under 12. Something like this is pretty intense, but it was because of the film that all kids should see. Everybody should be seeing Big Trouble in Little China. Because of this, I was able to find this. And that's the beauty of these films, that they're gateways to other films. Now, speaking of religious films, I grew up in a Catholic house. I am not a Catholic. I'm a card-carrying atheist, but I love Catholic horror. I love The Nun. I love anything to do with possession. I love possession movies. Anything to do with religious possession. I absolutely love the new Exorcist Believer movie. I know, hot take, this is not a popular opinion, but I love that movie. And that's because when I was 12 years old, my dad let me watch this, The Exorcist. This may have been a bad move in hindsight. This movie terrified me for all of my childhood. I have never seen a better film. This is, the cinematography is top shelf, the acting is top shelf, the music is top shelf, everything about this movie is top shelf. The possession is great. It haunted my dreams for years and years and years. Anything Catholic horror, Christian horror, religious horror, I am super, super down with. I think this is executed brilliantly and maybe hands down the greatest horror movie that's ever made in cinematic history. Again, that's a hot take. Every generation will tell you that their movie from their generation is the best, but I think Exorcist is where it's definitely at. Okay, we have now come to it, moms and dads. The next set of films I'm going to talk about are not kid appropriate. Sorry, little ones. When you get older, you can come back, you can watch this video. It's still going to be on YouTube, archived forever, but I do not want to be the person that brings these movies into the eyes and ears of your kids. So, we're going to pause for a few minutes. We'll give them a chance to leave the room. Then we'll come back and we'll talk about some really, really gritty horror movies.
A few moments later.
So cult movies were a huge thing for me. Watching a film I should not be allowed to watch at my age was the holy grail. Getting my hands on a copy of Faces of Death. Getting my hands on a copy of Basic Instinct. A film that I should have no business watching, but it was my only mission, my only goal was to get my hands on a copy of the greatest cult movies just to see what all the fuss was about. For me, it started with Evil Dead. Again, I can't even say top 5, top 10 horror movies anymore. There are so many movies that I would have 1,000 films in my top five. This is the beauty about cinema. You don't have to have a top five. They could all be your top five. You can love all these movies the same way. And Evil Dead was groundbreaking. Real in-camera practical effects. This was grosser than gross, creepier than creepy, and this was a film that I had to get my hands on. I had to see it because I felt I was missing out. In the same vein, I Spit on Your Grave. This is a movie that I've seen twice in my life. Once as a child when I found a copy and it was a bootleg copy that I got. I can't even remember where I got my hands on it. And then once when I actually picked up this version for the collection. Revenge movies are hard. Revenge movies are really hard to watch because traditionally there is some heinous act that takes place in the first half of the movie so that you can have a revenge film on the second half of the movie. This one in particular, if you haven't seen it, an author goes to a remote cottage in the woods, and a bunch of locals decide to go and terrorize her, and that turns into assault, and it turns into rape. And it's very brutal. It's very real. It seems almost like a snuff film. It's not entertaining to watch. It's hard to watch, but I think it's one of those films that, for sake of cinematic history, if you're a horror fan, if you're a slasher fan, pardon me, I think this is a film you need to at least watch once. But I will tell you, it's a very, very, very hard watch. And then I think the Godfather of all Grail cult movies has got to be Cannibal Holocaust. This movie was it says right there, the most controversial movie ever made, and I can't disagree with them. They took this cast of young actors and actresses to an Amazon rainforest, and they filmed this documentary, found footage almost style film. They ended up stumbling upon a group of cannibal tribesmen and tribeswomen, and again, terror ensues. There is a lot of animal torture in this movie. A lot of real animals were killed on screen. A little monkey and a turtle do die on screen. It's horrific stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very, very hard watch. There's an Eli Roth movie called The Green Inferno. I would highly recommend that. It's very brutal, but it's a little more tasteful than I think this film is. This film is just aggression in your eyeballs for 88 minutes. It's very, very, very hard. It's much like I Spit on Your Grave, where it's hard to take in what you're seeing, because even though it's actors, it feels very real. It feels like a snuff film. So I would say this is probably in the top of the most aggressive films I've ever seen. And again, I've only seen it a couple times because it's very hard to watch, but I wanted it in the collection just to say that I owned the piece of cinema history. Later in life, I found the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original one from Tobe Hooper. This is kind of what started me on wanting to see more aggressive, more violent, more brutal movies. This was a Hollywood film. It was a studio film, but it was so raw and so aggressive that kind of pushed me into watching films like Saw. It's very brutal. You're watching people suffer for an hour and a half. There needs to be some substance. It can't just be suffering. Then it's not entertainment anymore. So with the Saw films, I love the stories. All the Saw films are not good. I think all of the odd numbers are good, like 1, 3, 5, 7. Those are good. I haven't seen 10. I just picked up 10 on Blu-ray a couple days ago, so I'm going to watch that with my daughter this weekend. But yeah, this was an era where I think horror movies just weren't doing it for people anymore, and they really needed to have the envelope pushed. And you got directors coming in like Eli Roth, who are more than happy to push that envelope and give you some really uncomfortable things to watch, because once you ask for it, once you open the doors, there's no closing them. When you start saying what I'm seeing now, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Scream, when you start saying that these are not extreme, I want more, and you ask for it, Now we can't put the genie back in the bottle. So that's where the Saw franchise and the Hostel franchise comes out, is they're just the new renaissance of torture porn films, and the idea is to be as aggressive as possible. Once you think you've seen everything that Hollywood has to offer, you need to look beyond your own borders, because some of the greatest, most terrifying films ever made were not made in North America. Two films, the French film Martyrs and the Thai film Shudder, which I believe holds the number 2 spot under Exorcist as scariest movie that I've ever seen in my life. These are both foreign films. They both come in dub versions and subtitle versions. I recommend watching them in the language they were meant to be watched in and read them in the English subtitles. Dubs are not very good with films like this, but these are meant to be watched in the way that they were made, because they're just fantastic movies. And that's when I'd say to broaden your horizons, is get out there and look at Japanese films like The Audition, look at Thai films, look at French films, look at Korean films like The Host. There are so many films out there that aren't from our side of the pond, and you really got to open your mind and broaden your horizons and have a look and see what other people are making, because you are going to be blown away with how wonderful these foreign films are. And then I guess to close it all off, modern horror. I love modern horror. I'm not as jaded as a lot of these horror fans, where people have more fun complaining about the new horror rather than just enjoying the new horror. New horror means new IPs, and new horror also means remakes. I love the Rob Zombie Halloween movies. I love the Blumhouse Halloween movies that started in 2018. I know they're not remakes, they're more like requels or continuations, but I love those movies. I loved new films like Megan. Talk to Me, I'm saying, is the greatest horror movie of 2023. What a wonderful film. And then a movie like Smile. These modern movies with new ideas and new takes on old ideas are really pushing the genre forward. You will be surprised at what's coming to the cinema and the streaming services, Netflix, Prime, even Disney Plus. There are a lot of scary movies that have just come out in the last year and a half. And modern horror, don't let anybody look down on modern horror. Don't let anybody tell you that the classics are the only things worth watching. False. This is false. There are new films out there being made right now by brilliant directors and writers, brilliant actors and actresses. They are real classics in the making happening right now. And don't let that shit pass you by. Get on board with these new horror films, because they're going to blow your mind. And there you have it, moms and dads. I'm hoping that you got to know me and my tastes a little bit better. I'm hoping that I maybe have introduced you to some films and some TV shows that you can start watching with your kids right away and get them into being into scary movies or monsters or goblins or ghosts and that sort of thing. I'm hoping that I showed you some more extreme films that you haven't seen that maybe you want to check out yourself. There's a lot to do when you're not playing Lorcana. And for me, horror movies is just one of them. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you real soon.